A single father knight bought an 18-year-old maiden sold by her stepmother. He never expected she'd fall madly in love with him. But in the dusty market square of Greyford, where human lives were bartered like grain and livestock, love seemed as distant as mercy. The morning sun blazed merciless overhead, casting harsh shadows between the wooden stalls where merchants hawked their wares. Dust swirled in thick clouds, stirred by countless boots and wagon wheels, settling on everything like a shroud of indifference. The air reeked of unwashed bodies, rotting vegetables and desperation. Elara stood motionless in the center of it, all her wrists bound with coarse rope that had already rubbed her skin raw. Her once fine kirtle hung in tatters, stained with mud and worse, the blue fabric faded to the color of old bruises. Dark hair hung limp around her face, but she kept her chin raised despite everything, a small act of defiance that spoke louder than any plea. "She's young, not broken," her stepmother called out to a passing merchant, yanking Elara forward like a prized mare. "Can cook, clean, knows her letters. Look at that face. Ain't she worth something?" The merchant paused, circled them slowly, his eyes calculating. "Pretty enough, but thin. Does she work hard or just weep?" "She ain't spoke a word of complaint," the stepmother snapped. "Obedient as they come. That's why I'm letting her go. Too many mouths to feed, and this one's old enough to earn her keep elsewhere." Elara flinched as the woman's fingers dug into her shoulder, but she made no sound. She had learned that silence was sometimes the only dignity left to claim. From the edge of the crowd, Sir Gareth watched with growing distaste. He had come to Greyford's market seeking a new Destria, not to witness this mockery of human decency. The knight stood tall in his travel-worn surcoat, mud from 3 days' hard riding still caking his boots. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and lines of grief had etched themselves deep around his eyes, marks left by losses that had taught him the true value of protecting what mattered. The stepmother's voice rose sharper. 50 silver pieces, and she's yours. Young enough to train, old enough to be useful right away." Gareth's jaw tightened. He had seen enough of the world's cruelties, participated in too many himself in service to his lord. But something in the girl's silent endurance stirred an old instinct he thought he'd buried with his wife. "How much?" His voice cut through the marketplace chatter like a blade. The stepmother spun toward him, eyes lighting with avarice as she took in his fine sword, his bearing that spoke of noble blood and full purses. The knight's Destria moved, with steady purpose along the rutted road, its hooves striking a rhythmic beat against packed earth. Elara sat behind Sir Gareth, her bound hands clutching the saddle's cantle, every muscle tense with uncertainty. The rope around her wrists had been cut away the moment they left the market square, but freedom felt as foreign as the man whose broad back shielded her from the wind. Miles passed in silence, broken only by the creak of leather and the distant call of crows. Elara studied the knight's shoulders, searching for clues in the set of his spine, the way his hands held the reins. He had paid her stepmother without haggling. 50 silver pieces dropped into greedy palms like he was buying bread, not a life. The transaction had been swift, businesslike, and that terrified her more than any rough handling. "Where are we going?" she finally whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "My keep, 3 leagues north." His voice was steady, neither kind nor cruel. "You'll have work there." "Work." The word settled uneasily in her chest. She had heard whispers in the market about what work young women did in knights' households, especially those bought rather than hired. Her stepmother's parting sneer echoed in memory. "Make yourself useful, girl, or you'll find yourself back in worse places." The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly. When Elara swayed slightly from heat and hunger, Gareth's hand moved. To steady her elbow, a brief touch, careful and impersonal. He said nothing, but at the next bend in the road, he guided his horse toward a small stream shadowed by oak trees. "Drink," he said, dismounting first, then offering his hand to help her down. Elara hesitated before accepting his assistance. His grip was firm but gentle, and he released her the moment her feet touched solid ground. She knelt by the water's edge, cupping the cool stream in her palms, acutely aware of him standing guard a respectful distance away. "Are you hungry?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. From his saddlebag he produced bread and dried meat, offering, half without ceremony. They ate in continued silence, but something in the quality of that quiet had shifted. It wasn't the heavy silence of the market square, thick with judgment and transaction. This felt neutral, waiting. When they resumed their journey, Ilara found herself studying the countryside rather than the night's intentions. Rolling hills stretched toward distant mountains, dotted with sheep, and crossed by stone walls that spoke of order, of care. Whatever lay ahead, it was taking her away from the suffocating cruelty she had known. As if sensing her thoughts, Gareth spoke without turning. "I have a son, 8 years old. He'll need gentle handling." The words hung between them, an offering of sorts, not a promise, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Blackmore Keep rose from the hillside like a sleeping giant, its grey stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain. As they passed through the iron portcullis, Ilara felt the weight of ancient stones settling around her, not oppressive, but solid, permanent in a way that made her chest tighten with something she couldn't name. The courtyard bustled with quiet efficiency. Servants moved with purpose, their faces curious but not unkind, as they watched Sir Gareth dismount. A stable boy hurried forward to take the reins, nodding respectfully but saying nothing. Everything spoke of order, of a household that ran on, routine rather than fear. "Marta," Gareth called to a plump woman emerging from what appeared to be the kitchen. "This is Ilara. She'll be helping with the household." The cook's eyes were shrewd but not unkind as she looked Ilara up and down. "Aye, my lord. Kitchen first, I'd say. Girl looks half-starved." Ilara found herself swept into the kitchen's warmth, seated at a scarred wooden table while Marta bustled about preparing a proper meal. The familiarity of kitchen sounds, chopping, stirring, the hiss of meat in a pan, should have been comforting, but uncertainty made every gesture feel wrong. "Can you cook?" Marta asked, setting down a bowl of thick stew. "Some. Bread, pottage, roasted fowl." Ilara's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Good. We'll see what you know tomorrow." That evening, Ilara stood uncertainly in the great hall as Sir Gareth entered, with a small figure trailing behind him. The boy had his father's dark hair, but none of his steady presence. Thomas moved like a shadow, staying close to walls, his large brown eyes watchful and wary. "Thomas," Gareth said gently, "this is Ilara. She'll be staying with us." The boy said nothing, just stared at her for a long moment before ducking behind his father's leg. Supper was a quiet affair. Gareth ate methodically, occasionally glancing at his son, who picked at his food without appetite. Ilara sat at the far end of the table, acutely aware of every scrape of her spoon against the bowl, every breath that seemed too loud in the cavernous hall. "The boy doesn't speak much," Marta had warned her earlier. "Not since his mother passed. Best to let him come to you in his own time." When Thomas accidentally knocked over his cup, sending ale spreading across the table, Ilara moved instinctively to clean it. But the boy flinched away from her approach, his chair scraping against stone as he shrank back. "It's all right," she said softly, mopping up the spill with her own napkin. "No harm done." Thomas watched her with those two serious eyes, then quietly pushed his untouched bread toward her side of the table, a small offering, or perhaps an apology. That night, lying on a straw pallet in the servants' quarters, Ilara stared at the ceiling beams and wondered what gentle handling truly meant. Morning light filtered through the castle courtyard as Ilara swept the stones near the well. 3 days had passed since her arrival, and she had learned to move quietly through Blackmore's routines, keeping to the edges, making herself useful without drawing attention. Thomas appeared in the doorway of the keep, a wooden sword clutched in his small hands. He stood there for several minutes, watching her work with that same serious expression she had grown accustomed to. When she glanced up and smiled, he didn't flee as he had the first day. "That's a fine sword," she said softly, continuing her sweeping. "Do you practice with it?" The boy said nothing, but he stepped into the courtyard, moving to a patch of sun-warmed stones. He began a series of slow, careful movements, parrying imaginary opponents, his brow furrowed in concentration. Ilara found herself pausing in her work, recognizing something in the deliberate precision of his actions. He wasn't just playing. He was remembering, following steps someone had taught him. "Your father showed you those moves?" she asked. Thomas stopped mid-thrust, his eyes meeting hers briefly before he nodded. It was the first direct response he had given her. That afternoon, Marta sent Ilara to Thomas's chamber to collect linens for washing. The room was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed and a chest carved with intricate patterns. What caught her attention were the objects carefully arranged. On a wooden shelf, a painted wooden horse, a collection of smooth river stones, and a woman's silk ribbon. Faded blue, but preserved with obvious care. Thomas appeared in the doorway, finding her standing before his treasures. For a moment, tension flickered across his features, the same wariness she had seen when he knocked over his cup. "I'm sorry," Ilara said quickly. "I was just gathering the bedding." But Thomas stepped closer, reaching for the ribbon. He held it carefully, his small fingers tracing the silk as if it might dissolve at too rough a touch. "It's beautiful," Ilara whispered. "Was it your mother's?" The boy's throat worked, his eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. He nodded once, then surprised her by holding the ribbon out for her to see more closely. Ilara knelt to his level, studying the delicate weaving. "She must have been very lovely." Thomas's voice, when it finally came, was barely audible. "She smelled like lavender." The words hung in the air between them, precious and fragile. Ilara felt her own throat tighten, remembering her own mother's. "Hands," the songs hummed in the darkness before everything changed. "I bet she loved you very much," she said. Thomas clutched the ribbon tighter, then carefully returned it to its place on the shelf. When he looked at Ilara again, something had shifted. A door opened just the smallest crack. From the corridor came the sound of Sir Gareth's approaching footsteps, and Thomas quickly busied himself with straightening his wooden sword. The morning, Ilara ruined the bread. She thought surely Sir Gareth would send her back to the market square. The loaves had burned black while she tended to Thomas, who had scraped his knee in the courtyard and come to her with tears he wouldn't shed for anyone else. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Marta, staring at the charred remains. "I should have watched more carefully." But Marta only clicked her tongue and handed her fresh flour. "Bread can be made again. Boys heal better with gentle tending. You did right." Still, Ilara's hands shook as she kneaded the new dough, expecting at any moment to hear Sir Gareth's heavy footsteps and the words that would end her fragile place here. Instead, she found him in the herb garden that afternoon, teaching Thomas the names of healing plants. The boy knelt beside his father, carefully touching sage and lavender, while Gareth spoke in patient, quiet tones. "This one helps with sleep," Gareth was saying. "Your mother used to brew it into tea when storms kept you awake." Thomas nodded solemnly, then looked up as Ilara approached with the afternoon meal. "Ilara knows about herbs, too," he said suddenly, his voice still soft but clearer than before. "She made my knee stop hurting." Gareth's eyes met hers across the garden, something shifting in his expression. "Did she?" "Comfrey leaves," Ilara said quietly, setting down the tray. "My mother taught me, for cuts and bruises." "Show me." The command was gentle, but it was still a command. Ilara found the plant among Gareth's carefully tended rows, her fingers sure as she demonstrated how to prepare a poultice. She was acutely aware of his attention, the way he watched her hands, listened to her soft explanations. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. "Before my father died, we lived near the forest. Mother gathered herbs for the village women." The words came easier than expected. She said healing hands were a gift not to be wasted. Thomas tugged at her skirt. "Will you teach me?" Over the following days, she found herself drawn into small lessons, showing Thomas how to bind wounds on his wooden practice sword, teaching him which plants grew wild near the castle walls. When Gareth discovered them in the stables one evening, Thomas carefully applying herb salve to a horse's minor cut, he didn't interrupt. "The boy's never shown such interest in healing before," he said later, finding Ilara alone in the kitchen. "He has gentle hands," she replied, not looking up from her mending. "Like his father." Gareth was quiet for a long moment. When she finally glanced up, he was studying her with an expression she couldn't read. Not the wariness of their first days, but something deeper, more thoughtful. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. The words hung between them, neither quite compliment nor question, but something that made her pulse quicken in a way she didn't yet understand. The village market bustled with its usual chaos when Sir Gareth brought Ilara to Greyford for supplies. She walked a respectful distance behind him, a woven basket clutched in her hands, trying to ignore the stares that followed their passage between the stalls. "That's her," came a whisper from behind a cloth merchant's table. "The girl he bought." "Ilara's." Steps faltered slightly, but she kept her eyes fixed on Gareth's broad shoulders ahead. She had grown accustomed to safety within Blackmoor's walls, had almost forgotten how exposed the outside world could make her feel. "Pretty thing," another voice murmured. "Wonder what she really does to earn her keep." Heat crept up Ilara's neck as snickers followed the comment. She focused on her task, salt, honey, thread for mending, anything to avoid the calculating looks of the women who clustered near the baker's stall. At the cloth merchant's table, Gareth paused to examine linen for Thomas's outgrown tunics. Ilara stood quietly beside him, grateful for his solid presence, until a voice cut through the market noise like a blade. "Mighty fine clothes for a servant girl," the baker's wife said loudly enough for half the market to hear. "Course, I suppose some services pay better than others." The implication hit like a physical blow. Ilara's face burned as conversations around them quieted, waiting for entertainment. She started to step back, to disappear into the crowd. But Gareth's hand settled firmly on her shoulder. "Something you wish to say to me, goodwife Maren?" His voice carried the authority of steel and noble blood, cutting through the market chatter like a sword, through silk. The woman's smirk faltered. "Just observing, my lord, no offence meant." "Then observe this." Gareth's tone grew dangerously quiet. "The lady serves in my household with honor. She tends my son with more care than his own blood showed him, and she has my protection in all things. Any who question her place, question me." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Ilara felt the weight of every stare, but also the unwavering steadiness of Gareth's hand, still resting protectively on her shoulder. "Now," he continued, his voice returning to normal volume but losing none of its authority, "I believe you have bread to sell, and I have coin to spend. Shall we conduct business, or shall I take my trade elsewhere?" The baker's wife stumbled over herself to offer her finest loaves. The market slowly resumed its noise, but Ilara felt the change, the way conversations turned away from her, the cautious respect that now colored the glances sent their way. As they walked back toward the castle, Gareth spoke quietly without looking at her. "You need not endure such talk in silence. I'm used to it, Ilara replied softly. You shouldn't have to be. The certainty in his voice made something warm unfurl in her chest. Not anymore. The storm struck Blackmore without warning, sending sheets of rain against the castle's ancient stones. Thunder rolled across the hills like the hoofbeats of some great army, and lightning split the sky with brilliant, jagged scars. Ilara found Sir Gareth standing alone in the great hall, staring into the massive fireplace where flames danced and hissed. He held a cup of wine in his hands, but it remained untouched, forgotten. Something in his stillness made her pause in the doorway. "Thomas is sleeping," she said softly. "The storm doesn't seem to trouble him." Gareth turned, and in the firelight, she saw something raw in his expression, a pain so deep it took her breath away. "It should," he said quietly. "It was a night like this when his mother died." The words hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Ilara stepped closer, drawn by an instinct she didn't fully understand. She was afraid of storms. Gareth continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Lightning made her shake like a leaf. But that night, she was already shaking from the fever, so I didn't think. He set down the wine with hands that trembled slightly. I should have known the difference. "What happened?" Ilara asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. The answer, childbed fever, took her 3 days after Thomas was born. His jaw worked as if the words cut his throat. "I was away when it started, called to settle a boundary dispute that seemed so important at the time. When I returned, she was already burning with it." Another crack of thunder shook the castle walls. Gareth flinched as if struck. "I held her, and while she died," he said, "this great night, trained in war and weapons, and I couldn't save the one person who mattered most, couldn't even ease her passing." Ilara found herself moving closer, until she stood near enough to see the tears. He refused to shed, glistening in his eyes. "She made me promise to take care of Thomas, to not let grief turn me bitter. But when I look at him, I see her eyes, her gentle spirit, and I remember how I failed her." His voice cracked. "How can I protect him when I couldn't protect her?" Without thinking, Ilara reached out and touched his hand. His fingers were cold, despite the fire's warmth. "You didn't fail her," she said firmly. "You loved her. You gave her a son who carries her memory with honor. That's not failure. That's the kind of love that survives death itself." Gareth's eyes met hers, and in that moment, the careful distance they had maintained crumbled like castle walls under siege. For the first time since that day in the market, she saw him not as the stern knight who had bought her freedom, but as a man broken by loss and struggling to heal. The morning after the storm, Ilara found Thomas sitting on his bed, holding something wrapped in soft linen. Sunlight streamed through his chamber window, casting everything in gentle gold, but the boy's expression was solemn as ancient stone. "I have something for you," he said quietly, not looking up from the bundle in his hands. Ilara sat carefully, beside him, on the narrow bed. "You don't need to give me anything, Thomas." "I want to." His small fingers worked at the cloth, revealing a delicate silver chain with a pendant shaped like a star. The metal caught the morning light, throwing tiny rainbows across the walls. It was Mama's. Papa gave it to her when they were wed. Ilara's breath caught. "Thomas, this is too precious. You should keep it." "She wore it every day," he continued, as if he hadn't heard her protest. "When I was small and had bad dreams, she would let me hold it while she sang to me. It smelled like lavender, just like her hair." His voice grew steadier as he spoke, as if sharing the memory gave him strength rather than taking it away. "Papa put it away after she died, said it was too painful to see. But I asked him for it yesterday, after the storm." Thomas finally looked at Ilara, his brown eyes serious but no longer haunted. "I think Mama would want someone to wear it again, someone who takes care of people like she did." Tears pricked Ilara's eyes as Thomas held out the necklace with both hands, like an offering at an altar. "Will you wear it?" he asked. "Not always, but sometimes, so it doesn't stay hidden in the dark." Ilara took the chain with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of trust and memory. "If you're certain." Thomas nodded solemnly, then surprised her by scrambling off the bed. "Come, I want to show you something else." He led her down the corridors to the castle's small chapel, where morning light filtered through stained glass windows, painting the stone floor in jeweled colors. At the altar stood a statue of the Virgin, hands outstretched in blessing. "Mama used to pray here every morning," Thomas said, his voice echoing softly in the sacred space. "She said prayers were like letters to heaven, and if you were very still, sometimes heaven wrote back." They knelt together on the worn stones, and Thomas closed his eyes tight in concentration. When he opened them again, he smiled, the first true smile Ilara had seen from him. "I asked her to help Papa stop being so sad," he whispered, "and to help you feel like you belong here, because I think you do." Outside the chapel, Sir Gareth stood in the doorway, having come to find his son. He watched as Ilara fastened his wife's necklace around her throat, watched Thomas beam with pride, and felt something long frozen in his chest begin to thaw. Sir Gareth had been gone 3 days, summoned to his Lord's Council in the neighbouring shire, when Thomas collapsed in the courtyard. One moment he was chasing the castle's barn cat, laughing as she darted between his legs, and the next he was on his knees, retching violently onto the cobblestones. Ilara dropped her basket of herbs and ran to him, pressing her palm to his burning forehead. The fever was already raging, turning his skin hot as forge metal, while his small body shook with chills. "Marta," she called, gathering Thomas into her arms. "Send word to the village healer." But old Godwin was away birthing a difficult foal, and the nearest physician was a day's hard ride through dangerous territory. As darkness fell, Ilara found herself alone, with a desperately sick child and terror clawing at her throat. Thomas's fever climbed throughout the night. He tossed and turned, delirious, calling for his mother in a voice that broke Ilara's heart. She bathed his burning skin with cool cloths, forced small sips of willow bark tea between his cracked lips, and prayed to every saint she could remember. "Mama," he whispered, his eyes unfocused and glassy. "Mama, it hurts." "I'm here," Ilara murmured, smoothing his sweat-dampened hair. "I won't leave you." By the second night, his breathing grew labored, each breath a struggle. Ilara had seen this before, the way fever could steal the life from children, leaving parents to bury small bodies before their time. She remembered her mother's desperate fight to save a neighbor's daughter, the herbs gathered in moonlight, the ancient remedies passed down through generations of healing women. With shaking hands, she prepared a poultice of comfrey and feverfew, wrapped his chest in warm cloths steeped with eucalyptus. She sang the lullabies her mother had taught her, the same songs that had once soothed her own childhood fears. "Don't you dare leave your father," she whispered fiercely as Thomas's breathing grew shallower. "He's lost enough. We both have." On the third dawn, as pale light crept through the chamber windows, Thomas's fever finally broke. His breathing eased, and he slept peacefully for the first time in days. Ilara collapsed in the chair beside his bed, exhausted beyond measure, but flooded with relief. When Marta found her there hours later, still keeping vigil, the older woman's eyes were bright with tears. "You saved him," she said quietly. "If Sir Gareth had lost the boy too." Ilara touched the silver star at her throat, thinking of another woman who had loved this child, who had trusted her memory to Ilara's care. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats on cobblestones announced Sir Gareth's return. Soon he would climb these stairs, expecting to find his son healthy and whole, never knowing how close they had come to tragedy. Sir Gareth's destrier thundered into the courtyard just as the evening. Bells rang across Blackmoor's walls. Dust swirled from beneath iron-shod hooves, and his face was grim with the exhaustion of 3 days' hard riding. Ilara waited near the stable, her heart lifting at his safe return. But the relief died when she saw his expression as Marta hurried forward with news of Thomas's illness. "Where is he?" Gareth's voice cut through the courtyard noise like a blade. "Sleeping, my lord," Marta said quickly. "The fever broke this morning. Ilara tended him through the worst of it." Gareth's eyes found Ilara across the yard, and something flickered in them, gratitude perhaps, but darker emotions as well. He dismounted and strode past her without a word, taking the stone steps 2 at a time to reach his son's chamber. Ilara followed at a distance, her stomach knotting with unnamed dread. She found Gareth kneeling beside Thomas's bed, one large hand resting gently on the boy's forehead. Thomas stirred at his father's touch, managing a weak smile. "Papa," he whispered. "Ilara made me better. She sang Mama's songs." Gareth's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Rest now," he said softly, but when he stood and turned to face Ilara, his expression was stone. In the corridor outside Thomas's chamber, the careful distance that had slowly dissolved between them slammed back into place like a portcullis dropping. "He could have died," Gareth said, his voice low and controlled. "But he didn't," Ilara replied, confusion making her voice smaller than she intended. "The fever broke. He's going to be well. This time." The words were sharp as winter wind. "What if it happens again? What if next time your herbs aren't enough?" Ilara stared at him, seeing not gratitude, but something that looked almost like accusation. "I don't understand. I did everything I could. And if you had failed?" Gareth's control cracked slightly. "If I had returned to find him? If I had lost him while trusting his care to—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the words hung between them like a blade. "To someone who was bought, to someone who owes me nothing, to someone who could leave." The truth hit Ilara like a physical blow. This wasn't about her failure to save Thomas. It was about her success, about how completely she had woven herself into their lives, how much it would destroy them both if she were gone. "You're afraid," she said quietly, understanding flooding through her, "not of losing Thomas to illness, but of needing me too much." Gareth's eyes went hard as flint. "Perhaps it would be better if you sought employment elsewhere. I can provide references, coin for your journey." "After everything?" The words tore from her throat. "After Thomas nearly died, calling for his mother while I held him, after I gave him back his life." "Because of it," Gareth said roughly. "Don't you see? I can't—" He stopped himself, turned away. "Make your preparations. You'll leave at week's end." Ilara stood frozen in the corridor as his footsteps echoed away, her world crumbling like ancient stone. The abandoned chapel stood half-hidden among ancient oaks, its stone walls weathered by time and sorrow. Ivy crept up the sides like gnarled fingers, and the wooden door hung askew on rusted hinges. Ilara had discovered it during her first week at Blackmoor, drawn by the peace that seemed to hover over the forgotten place like morning mist. Now she knelt before the simple altar, her travelling bundle beside her on the cracked stone floor. Tomorrow she would be gone, but tonight she needed sanctuary, a place to grieve what might have been. The silver star necklace lay heavy against her throat, and she touched it with trembling fingers. Thomas had cried when she told him she was leaving, clinging to her skirts until Marta gently pulled him away. The memory of his tears was a knife in her chest. "I don't know why he's sending me away," she whispered to the empty chapel. "I thought we were becoming a family." Outside, wind stirred the oak branches, sending shadows dancing across the broken windows. In the gathering dusk, she could just make out the small stone marker beneath the largest tree, the grave where Gareth's wife lay sleeping. "Help me understand," Ilara pleaded, speaking to the memory of a woman she had never met, but whose love still shaped every corner of Blackmoor. "He loved you so deeply. How can I compete with a ghost?" The sound of hoofbeats on the forest path made her heart leap. Through the chapel's broken door, she saw Sir Gareth dismount from his destrier, his face haggard in the dying light. He stood uncertainly at the threshold, as if unsure of his welcome in this sacred place. "Thomas told me where you'd gone," he said quietly. "He's asking why his papa is making Ilara leave when she saved his life." Ilara rose slowly, her hands clenched at her sides. "And what did you tell him?" "Nothing. Because I have no answer that makes sense." Gareth stepped inside, removing his hat as if entering a true sanctuary. "I've been a fool, Ilara, a coward." "You were protecting yourself," she said, though the words came out bitter as wormwood. "No." He moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I was protecting my wife's memory. I thought if I let myself love again, it would somehow diminish what she meant to me. But Thomas made me see the truth." Gareth knelt before her then, a knight, humbling himself on holy ground. From his coat he drew a simple gold ring, worn smooth by years of faithful wearing. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I want you to have it, not as payment or obligation, but as promise. Stay with us, Ilara, not as a servant, but as my wife, as Thomas's mother." The chapel held its breath, waiting for her answer, while outside the oak trees whispered their ancient blessings over the living and the dead. The castle's chapel had never seen such splendor. Wildflowers gathered from the meadows adorned the altar where once only dust and shadows had held court. Villagers packed the wooden pews, their faces bright with curiosity and growing approval as they watched their lord prepare to wed the girl he had once bought in their very marketplace. Ilara stood before the altar in a gown of deep blue silk, Gareth's wedding gift, the color of summer skies and hope renewed. The silver star necklace rested against her throat, while his mother's gold ring waited on her finger like a promise kept. Behind her, Thomas fidgeted in his finest tunic, holding the priest's prayer book with the solemnity of a sacred trust. "Do you, Sir Gareth of Blackmoor," the priest intoned, his voice echoing off ancient stones, "take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" "I do," Gareth said, his eyes never leaving Ilara's face. The words carried the weight of genuine choice, not obligation, love freely given after being freely earned. When the priest turned to her, Ilara's voice rang clear and certain. "I do." As Gareth leaned down to kiss his bride, a small voice piped up from behind them, cutting through the chapel's reverent silence. "I love you, Mama Ilara." The congregation gasped. Thomas stood beaming, his face radiant with joy as he spoke. The words that had been locked inside him for 2 long years. Tears streamed down Ilara's cheeks as she knelt and gathered him into her arms, the 3 of them forming a circle of healing that had been years in the making. Later, in the great hall, the celebration spilled over with laughter and music. The same villagers who had once whispered cruel gossips now raised their cups in genuine toast to the new Lady of Blackmoor. Even goodwife Maren, the baker's wife, approached with grudging respect. "You've made a good match, my lady," she said, offering a curtsy that spoke of acceptance hard won. As evening settled over the castle, Ilara found herself on the ramparts with her new family, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Thomas sat between his parents, chattering excitedly about everything and nothing, his voice a gift that kept on giving. "No more ghosts," Gareth murmured, his arm around Ilara's waist as Thomas ran ahead to examine the battlements. "No," Ilara agreed, touching the necklace that had once belonged to another woman who was loved and remembered, but no longer mourned. Just family. In the distance, the abandoned chapel stood peaceful among its oaks, where old sorrows had been transformed into new joy, and where love had learned to bloom again in ground once thought barren. The knight had found his lady, the boy had found his voice, and Ilara had found her home.